Hello and welcome again to another episode of One Starfish, where our mission is to change the world one starfish or one person at a time. I'm really excited for our guest, Scott Volquartsen. I'm getting his last name, but he runs a arms, I guess you could say, store, and he's been in it. It's his second generation, so he's grown up in the business. He took over in 2000. He's a family guy, awesome dude, has an amazing podcast too. Check that out. We'll have all that stuff in the show notes. As always, make sure to rate, review, subscribe. That's how we're able to get the word out to more people if you see value this episode, which I know you will. So thank you so much for being on, Scott.
Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
Awesome. So let's get into right away what we talked about a little bit, back, and we'll go wherever this goes today. But you started in a family business, and for a lot of people, that's not. Some people are like, "Oh, that makes it easy." Some people are like, "That makes it hard." I think that's hard. Or can be anyway. What were some of the obstacles you navigated growing up, in a family business with, dealing with family and all that kind of stuff as opposed to just strangers?
So my dad started the business, and then both him and mom worked in it. And I started at the ground level, literally sweeping floors and doing all that. So the challenges were, we grew up and you look up to your parents and you're like, okay, this is how you have to do everything. And they taught us a lot of wonderful lessons and a lot of, valuable insight and ideas that we still use today. And it's the foundation of what we still do. The downside was I never really went and worked outside the family. So I think I missed out on a lot of different ideas that I could bring into the company. And for years, I avoided trying to learn anything from outside our industry, because I always said we were unique. We were a family business. We're in the firearms business. So a lot of what we see elsewhere, in my mind, I said doesn't apply to us. Mm-hmm. And I couldn't have been more wrong, because as you well know, it doesn't matter what business you're in, building relationships, networking, connections, all those principles still apply. So I feel very fortunate now that I've been able to, meld some of that and different things that I've learned at different conferences and events and different mentoring groups into what my parents kind of established with our family business, and I still say I still think getting a business off the ground is the hard part, from marketing, building a name. So by the time we came in, they had built a wonderful reputation for quality, and they had kind of set the groundwork for what we do, which is specialized in high-end 22s and rimfires. Okay. So they had laid that groundwork, but the challenging part was then being able to put our own spin on things, because my brother co-owns the business with me, and anybody that's ever operated a business with their family, there's great things because you have the general direction of where you want to go is very similar. Mm-hmm. You have your name is on the business. So you have that, but sometimes the ideas of how we want to get there vary, and we will butt heads.
Which sometimes can be easier with family because you can just be straight up, I feel like, on a different level, but I would imagine sometimes it would be hard. So what are some obstacles that you've had to overcome beyond, so you mentioned that you really thought that there was no one else that could help you outside your business, so you didn't look for help. What created the change for you to go outside and realize that, other businesses, other companies, whether in a family or not, would be able to help you with your situation? Or was kind of a catalyst that started to switch that?
So my dad was big on, he only hired within the family. He didn't want to have a lot of employees. So by default, that was always going to keep it smaller than what we felt it could become. But then as we started hiring people and bringing more people into the fold, we started noticing an issue with our culture and different things. And I don't 100% know what the catalyst was, but you start realizing that people are people regardless of what industry or business they're in. Mm-hmm. And I think it was, just taking that leap of faith and going to my first event or hiring a first business coach and realizing they had nothing to do with the firearms industry. But every time they would bring up a point or I would learn something, I'm like, that applies 100% to what we're doing. And the more I kind of went down that road and I opened my mind and realized there's a lot of parallels between our business and any other business that's out there, it just kind of kept compounding there.
That makes sense. That's awesome. And when did you feel that, when was that switch? How many years ago? When did you feel that started to switch?
It was probably back in 2010.
Okay. It's been a while.
Yeah. And it was ironic because one of the very first events I went to was actually like it was more like a fitness weekend, but the guy that put it on, then he kind of went into like the personal development, business coaching space a little bit. So it was completely unrelated to what we do, but that kind of opened my eyes to realize, because we're from a smaller town of, there's only about 10,000 people. And it's easy to get stuck in the idea that, oh, we're doing pretty well when we compare ourselves to everybody else.
Right.
But when you get out there and you start looking at what's possible and what other people are doing, I kept coming back with the idea of we haven't even scratched the surface of what we can do yet.
So that started to stretch your vision in 2010. And then, how did that relate into your business and the growth? Like when you started getting into personal development and going to other events and stuff like that, when did you notice like an actual growth in your metrics of your business?
It took a couple years, but then it was since about 2015, there's been a steady growth year over year that we've increased our sales, increased profits, increased everything. And I think a lot of that is attributed to, we had to get over the mindset that we didn't have to do everything in every aspect of our business. And we started to empower some of the people that we had hired, and we're like, okay, you're really good at what you do. You're better at it than we are. Just go do it. And that was all stuff I learned that, you can't do everything yourself. And I think what I was running into is my brother and I, we would try to do as much as we could, and you end up not doing any of it very well. So yeah, about 2015, things really started to take off, and we became much more active in like working on our brand awareness, building those relationships, because for all the great that my dad did running our business, he wasn't big on trying to build up the network and those relationships as much. And a lot of it, it was a different time. We didn't have social media. It wasn't as easy to do. But also he was very active in working in the business, sometimes more so than on the business. So it's not necessarily he didn't know he had to do it. It was probably more just lack of time.
Yeah, and he was happy probably where he's at. He didn't really see any need to necessarily grow either. Who knows?
Correct. And that was the one thing, is we grew up in a family business where we took very few vacations, because every time mom and dad were gone, nothing was getting done in the shop. We weren't generating any income. And I think my brother and I both looked at it that we would like to be able to travel and do things and not have to completely have the business shut down while we're gone.
Makes sense. Yeah. So you came with different. So I want anyone to listen. So if you guys were paying attention, 2010, we got into personal development, and 2015 is when the growth started. They say it takes 5 years for anything really to shift. So that's a 5-year cycle right there where, it takes 5 years, and a lot of people stop too soon. So if you're, hustling and grinding and growing yourself, give it that 5 years. I know that's about what it was for me too. So give it that 5 years at least to actually start to see the growth compound from the personal development. So if you had someone like came up to you now and said, hey, Scott, what are some tips that, we're getting started in business and, we're starting to build out, what are some things that you think they should pay attention to avoid maybe some of the traps that you fell into, or some landmines that you went through that maybe could help them not go through the same ones?
I think one of the biggest things I learned as we went along and as things started to get better is we got really wrapped up in almost playing business, where we were doing things because we thought this is what you do as you grow. Where we didn't really evaluate, is this going to work and grow for our business? And the other thing that we struggle with, and I think I see this a lot in the firearms industry, is there's a lot of, well, this is how we've always done things. So it's very hard to challenge the narrative sometimes and try to do something new. But we started doing that, and ironic, or it's not ironic, it's coincidental that it also happened as I started doing the personal development stuff. But then to be patient when you dive into something, I think we're always looking for results so quickly. Mm-hmm. And, building that network, creating a culture, inside inside headquarters, all that takes time. And a lot of times it's hard to measure the progress with metrics. I think it's easy to get caught up. A lot of times we want to be very data driven. And even when it comes to marketing, okay, we did this. What's the ROI on this? Mm-hmm. Where we found sometimes we just had to trust our gut and just stick with it. And the first 6 months, there maybe was zero return. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting now because I'll look back and people be like, did you ever have a goal to get to this point? And I'm like, not really. We just kind of were in the middle of it and kept doing what we thought was right. Mm-hmm. But as you look back, you can see how this decision led to this decision. Mm-hmm. And, I think the biggest lesson I've learned is it's so easy to get wrapped up in trying to find that one big idea or the one big thing that's going to change everything. Mm-hmm. Because it's easy to point to, it's easy to, justify or measure, mm-hmm. but it's all the little things that take place day in and day out. And many times it's, as it's the simple things that get overlooked, mm-hmm. but you add all those together and that's when you can really start seeing results.
Mm-hmm. That's good. And so, you said, as you were growing in and you got into personal development, you were focusing on kind of the wrong things. What's something that would help someone focus on the right things in their business? And also, while I'm thinking about it, how do you start to build that team culture? So 2 different questions. So we'll go down both those rabbit trails.
Okay. I'll do the team culture one first because it's one of those things I don't think is ever, it's nothing that's ever done. It's a day in and day out thing. And our problem was we grew relatively fast from where mom and dad had it. We started adding employees and everything. And we were so actively working in the business that we weren't even worried about culture. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't for us, it was till it was too late. So advice I have is even if you're just starting out and you're 1 or 2 people, act as if you were going to have 20, 30, 50, 100 employees and start building that culture from day one, because mm-hmm. it's really hard to go back to people that have worked for you for 10 years and say, okay, like, hello, now, hey, I know we've always done it this way, but now it's going to go this way.
That's so good. Okay. So what are some ways that you were able, how did you start to shift it? Like, obviously this was a bit of a process, I would imagine. How did someone's listening, they're like, I haven't done that. I need a better culture. What were some steps that you've taken? Because I'm guessing you have a pretty good culture now. What are some steps that you took to start to shift that?
Some of it was having to just have uncomfortable conversations and say, okay, I understand this is how we've always done it, but we're growing. And in order for us to go from where we were to where we want to get to, it has to change. And for me, I think it started with me. I had to change the way I carried myself day in and day out.
Give us an example of that, if you don't mind, be a little vulnerable, Scott.
I think one of the biggest things is I'm not a confrontational person. I don't like having uncomfortable conversations. So I would always err to the side of really try to let them down softly and never really say what had to be said. Mm-hmm. Because in my mind, I didn't want to hurt their feelings.
Right. I get you. Mm-hmm.
But what I've learned is I was actually doing them a disservice, mm-hmm. because they couldn't live up to what we expected because they didn't know what it was. Mm-hmm. And so I think the biggest thing that we changed was our level of communication. Mm-hmm. Instead of just assuming everybody knew what we were thinking or what we were looking for, we had to open up lines of communication. We had to establish that a difficult conversation it's not necessarily a personal attack, or it's business. Mm-hmm. And in order for us to improve, this is what has to happen. So, and I will say communication is still something we're working on, but I think the lack of communication probably destroyed our culture initially more than anything, because we weren't overly transparent with what was going on sometimes. And with any company, I think you're going to have ebbs and flows, ups and downs with, at times you're going to be more profitable than others.
Mm-hmm.
And from an owner side or from an ego side, it's hard to sometimes let your employees know that, okay, we're going through a lean time now.
Mm-hmm.
Or, we're in a cash flow crunch right now.
Mm-hmm.
So it's tough to have them do what you want them to do when they only have 50% of the information.
Right. That totally makes sense. Yeah.
And growing up, where we were a family business and everything was kept within like just our family, that was a very difficult transition to start saying, okay, start being vulnerable and honest, because we expected out of them and we weren't doing it on our side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You got to live the core values first.
Yes. And I think you just said it. That's the biggest thing is if the people in charge aren't living the culture and doing that, like a lot of, very wise or smart coaches that we listen to will say, you have to set the standard and set the standard so high that that's what everybody else is trying to achieve.
Mm-hmm.
If you're not doing it, how can you ask anybody else to try to do that?
Yeah, that's so true.
And one other thing real quick, as I'm on that culture thing that I'll say is the other thing that I've learned is, take time to have conversations with, and, with everybody. I try to have conversations with everybody that works with us outside of just business talk. How are their kids doing? What are their kids involved in? And I'll even try to make notes sometimes of, okay, they had this, their kid has a gymnastics event this weekend. And then I will try to follow up and say, okay, how did that go? And I had one of our employees one time comment, they're like, I've never worked for somebody that cares about what my kids did over the weekend. So I think implementing stuff like that just builds a trust factor and removes some of the transactional business stuff that takes place day in and day out.
Mm-hmm. That's good. I know I had someone on my podcast who talked about kids, and someone on my podcast said they have a sign beside them that 45 employees and 96 kids rely on them as the leader.
I like that.
And so I actually just have gone through my licensed sales force and said, how many, we're just getting a number of kids. I think we're at 38 or something, under 18. And I'm like, okay, I just kind of like, it broadens your thought process. You're not just responsible for your employees, you're responsible for their kids.
I'm going to steal that because I think it also, you start to look at how many people everybody here is responsible for. It makes you think outside of just yourself.
You're like, I'm fine. And it's so easy, I think, to be like, well, I'm fine. I mean, like everyone else should be fine too. Well, they're not. Their kids aren't. And so, I just thought that was really cool. It was the guy that was just on.
And speaking of kids, the one thing that we do is we're very flexible with everybody that works here, even like the people in our, like on the assembly side, on the production side, is if their kids have an event, they're allowed to take off and go watch their kid play basketball, watch them, go watch the school play, whatever it is that comes up.
Wow, that's awesome.
Go take the time to do it, because my youngest son is 18. So I know how fast all that time goes.
Mm-hmm.
And the way I see it is, I've always said, if I feel like it's important that I'm going to take off and go watch my kids' stuff, who am I to tell somebody else that your kids are less important? You don't get to take off and go watch your kid.
Mm-hmm.
And those are just little things that we've had to learn over the years.
Those are big things. I love that. Made me have some thought processes. I love this.
So,
Yeah, that's so cool. And I think you've gone through 75 hard, have you not?
I have not. We talked about that when you were on my podcast.
We're going to work on that.
Do that.
Get you there. I love it. Yeah.
Because I've given myself every excuse in the book why it wouldn't work with my schedule. And that's all it is an excuse. So I will be doing that.
That's good. You have to let me know and let our audience know when you do it.
Yeah, I will do that.
Very cool. So you just gave one of the things that I just think is really awesome. Like letting the kids, so we say family first, and but having the parents be able to actually put their family first. And you're doing it by example, like you said. I think that's like I said, it gave me a lot to think about, and I think probably some other business owners are, hopefully that gives them something to think about too. Like, we say our family is important, but then by our actions, work is number one, or that kind of thing. And I know I'm
Yeah.
probably guilty of that. So I'll
And
just
and I will give my wife a lot of credit on that, because I was guilty, because I grew up where my dad was always working. So he didn't come to a lot of our events.
Right.
And I don't hold that against him whatsoever,
No.
because he was doing what he had to do to put food on the table.
Yeah, that was
So,
shit.
but I'm very glad she pointed that out to me at a very, very early on with our kids. And I was able to go attend all their different events. And I don't think we think it's going to hurt our work or our productivity. And I don't think it does. I think if anything, it probably improves it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Because
I think so too. People that feel good do more.
Yes. And I'm not saying I'm perfect. I've missed events traveling abroad or whatever it might be. But also my kids know that if I miss it, I had a very legitimate reason I could not make it.
Right. Yeah. Oh, that's so cool. So what are some other things that you just think are really important for people to know? I think like having your core values, being okay with uncomfortable situations, getting into personal development, giving yourself the time for that to compound and grow. Like, are a few things you kind of touched on. Is there anything else that you just think has been really impactful for you and your business, or you personally in your life, that maybe we didn't touch on yet, and you just think people should listen to?
I think one of the big things is give people time to think. We, as we grew, we were understaffed and always extremely busy. So everything we did was reactive.
Mm-hmm.
We, and it's tough to look at, like an employee or a team member sitting there, not necessarily doing anything.
Mm-hmm.
But I think you have to give them space at times to think and create ideas.
Mm-hmm.
Because if we're constantly reacting, where do any of the new ideas ever come from? So I know I've given myself time now every afternoon where I'm not by my computer, not by my phone. And it might only be like 15 minutes, but it's just me in a journal.
Hmm.
And I just write down ideas and different things. So, but the biggest thing is, I had to get past that point when I see other people do it, is, give them space, give them time to think, give them time to create, and then also allow them to fail.
Mm.
As you mentioned early on, I grew up in this business, and now I've been out here full time for the last 28 years.
Long time.
A long time. And I'm sure I've made a lot of mistakes, so, how can I expect other people not to make mistakes as they learn and go along? And that was the other thing, is we were not great early on at empowering people to learn and do their job.
Mm-hmm.
We were because initially we all worked in a very small office where we were all together, and they could just easily ask questions without ever having to dive in and learn it themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And after 3-4 years, I'm like, we're answering the exact same questions to the exact same people every single day.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't until we actually got away from that like group office environment and now have all individual offices. And it's not that they couldn't learn it. It's just, it was much easier to say, hey, how does this work? Or what about this? So that was the other thing, is learning to empower like the people that work for us, and realize that if you hire good people to do certain jobs, many times they're going to do it better than what we can. It's like the toughest example for me on that is my college degree was in tool and die. So initially I was the one that would program our machines and our computerized equipment. And in my mind, I felt like I was the only one that could do that. But then I was challenged through a coach that said, just do an 80-20 and, do the stuff that only you can do. And in my mind, and I think
like, that's everything.
Yeah. And I think this is why coaches are so important, or mentors, because in my mind, I'm like, well, I'm the only one that can do this. I'm the only one that can do that. And he just flat out said to me, he goes, are you the only one that can do that? Or does your ego tell you you're the only one that can do that?
Ooh.
And of course, my gut or my first reaction is, well, I'm the only one. So then, we branched out, we brought on different people, and I kind of had a conversation. I said, I'm turning this part of it over to you. And in fairness, he does it probably 100 times better than I ever could have. He's more creative in the shop. He's better at what he does. We're not even on the same playing field when it comes to that. So that's a case of where, people always say, how do you justify coaching, or why do you put so much into that? And I'm like, without that, I'd still be out in the shop most of the day trying to program machines at a hindrance to everybody that works for us. And more than likely, we would have lost this employee because
you'd have been micromanaging.
Yes. And he's like, I'm better. He would have said, I can do more than this. I'm being held back. And it would have cost us exponentially more than any amount of coaching I've ever paid for.
I think that's a really good one for people to listen. Like a lot of people, they're like, well, how can you invest into yourself? But if you can't invest in yourself, I mean, who will invest in you, first of all, too? But yeah, what you get out of it, you never really know what that one thing someone's going to say or do that just like really exponentially like blows up your business and makes things go big.
And something I've learned too is it may be a personal development thing that applies to business. It may be a business coach that says something that if it resonates at work, more than likely you're doing it everywhere else in your life. So to me, all that stuff is very intertwined. To me, it's not segregated that, okay, business is over here. My personal life is over here.
Right.
It all goes together. So if you can improve one area of your life, I feel like it'll bleed into every other area. And how do you ever put a value or an ROI on that? Like you said earlier, compound interest, when it's 3, 4, 5 years of doing that, how do you ever put a value on where you're at now versus then?
I think that's so true. I don't know. People ask me that all the time too. They're like, well, do you get your ROI at I'm like, over the long period, I sure have. Like, I don't know about like right then and there, but like over the period I have.
So. Well, and that's like, I've told, the gentleman that heads up our marketing, I'm like, yes, we need an ROI, eventually it needs to come back. And, but I said, I'm not going to dive into the metrics of this one particular idea because, especially in today's world, when you're working with, maybe brand ambassadors or, different things like that, it's almost impossible to measure. And, and for us, our best form of advertising is still word of mouth. How do you ever put a value on that?
Yeah, you can't. That's so awesome. Well, in wrapping up, Scott, I always ask 3 final questions every time, and then anything that we might not have touched on that you think would be just really valuable for listeners. So if you have someone that's looking for their purpose, what's one sentence that you could say that could help them find their purpose?
Find the one thing that you're passionate about and you're constantly thinking about, whether you're getting paid to do it or not.
Like that. That's really good. And for anyone listening to multiple episodes, we hear basically the same thing quite a bit. So hopefully you're paying attention. Number 2, and I'm sure you have more than one.
One thing I'll say on that is I had a very good friend of mine tell me that you have to remember sometimes your purpose is not your platform. So like you can, if you build a platform one way, you may then be able to use that for a higher purpose. So they don't, they don't always have to be the exact same thing. And I thought that was it's always stuck with me ever since I heard that.
I like that. That's a good point for anyone too. Number 2, and I'm sure there's more than one, but what's a favorite quote and why?
Yeah, there's so many good ones out there. One of my favorite is, make sure I don't butcher it here, is average men live their life by their circumstances. Great men live their life by their commitments.
Holy mic drop. That is so good. Oh man.
And the reason I like that is, so many times we want to be victims of something that's happened to us, something somebody did to us, something out of our control, whatever. But if we're committed to, what we want to do, I always go back to a lot of people talk about this, but like, if you really want to see what commitment is, follow an addict around.
Yeah,
they can be broke. They can be living on the street. They can be whatever. They are going to find their way to get their fix.
Yeah.
So a lot of times, we say we're committed, but we're really not.
Mm-hmm.
Then we blame the circumstances of why it didn't turn out.
Yeah. I love that you touch on that, because that's something I always tell people. They're like, I can't afford whatever it is. I'm like, if you were an addict, you'd figure it out.
Yes.
So,
they can't afford what they're getting, but they find a way to do it.
That's
it
right.
might not always be legal or moral, but they find a way.
That's true. There is that side, but they do always figure it away.
Yes.
And number third question is, what's one word or sentence you want on your gravestone?
Caring.
Caring. That's a good one. I like it. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, and I say that because that's not always who I've been. When I was younger, I was much more focused on myself in the wrong ways. And as I've gotten older, I've learned, when we're young, we think success is financial, and it can be whatever. But then as you get older, you realize, that if you truly care about people, that's what they talk about after you're gone. 5 years after you're gone, they don't care how much money you made or, what accomplishment you did. They remember how you made them feel.
Yeah, John Maxwell's big on that. I love that. So like I said, in wrapping up, you have someone that's like, man, they listen to this and they're like, well, we're going to work on this team culture. We're going to work on personal development. Or we're going to work on all these things. But is there anything that we didn't touch on today? If you ran into someone in the coffee shop and said, hey, Scott, listen to the podcast, it was awesome, I'm doing all these things. Is there something that we didn't touch on today that you just think, really impactful that we need to touch on?
I think one of the biggest things for me is I got wrapped up in the personal development culture where I was going to events. I was listening to every podcast that was out there. I was reading books, but I almost started doing it in place of taking action. So I think there's a trap that you can fall into. And I think you touched on this when you were on my podcast. There's that trap that you fall into of always learning, always trying to improve, which is awesome. But at some point, if you don't put it into action, it doesn't really do anything. And I even heard, I was at an event years ago, Tim Ferriss said something like, reading is first world procrastination. And he's like, and he said, I don't mean that badly, because, obviously he's an author, but he said, there's a lot of people that will keep consuming.
Not applying.
Yeah. And something else, and I took this kind of from you, and it is find like just a couple people that resonate with you and dive into everything they're doing. Because otherwise you get caught in that trap of, well, this person said you need to do this, and then this person says you need to do this. And sometimes they conflict with each other. And then in my case, I'm like, well, now I got to read one more book to find out who's right.
Yeah, the third option.
So, I think you can accelerate that, that 5 years that we talked about earlier. I think you can accelerate that somewhat by really just finding somebody that you believe in. And then the other thing is, start small, just change one action. A lot of times that'll bleed into a lot of other actions. And I mean, as you know, the bottom line is it's going to require work. There's no hack. There's no
dang work.
There's no quick fix. There's no, yes. Do you see the people that strike it rich? Yes. All that stuff. I understand that. But most of the people I know that are been really successful and are really happy in life, they've done it through hard work and willing to take chances.
That's good. I love it. As always, guys, make sure to rate, review, subscribe, and, follow Scott. Like I said, we'll have everything in the show notes. Make sure you reach out to him if you have any questions. The guy's a great guy to talk to. And let's go out there. Let's change one person or one starfish at a time. Together, if we change one life at a time together, we can change the world. Thanks, Scott.
Thank you. I appreciate it.